Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, the sun would peek over the horizon and cast long shadows across the abandoned airfield outside Nellis Air Base. That's when Samuel Martinez would arrive, carrying his worn leather toolbox and a thermos of black coffee. The guards at the main gate had grown accustomed to seeing the 70-year-old man, with his weathered hands and quiet demeanor, walking toward the far corner of the property, where an old military transport plane sat forgotten. The aircraft was a massive C-130 Hercules, its gray paint faded and peeling after years of neglect. Most people would have seen nothing but scrap metal, but Samuel saw something different. Every morning he would set down his toolbox, take a long sip of coffee, and begin his ritual of cleaning and maintaining the abandoned plane. Samuel had been doing this for 3 years now, ever since he'd moved to the small town of Henderson, Nevada, after his wife Martha had passed away. The local residents thought he was just an eccentric old man with too much time on his hands. Some whispered that grief had affected his mind, while others assumed he was a former mechanic trying to relive his glory days. The truth was something none of them could have imagined. Samuel would start each day by walking around the entire aircraft, checking every visible bolt, rivet, and panel. His trained eye could spot the smallest signs of corrosion or damage that others would miss completely. He carried with him a collection of rags, metal polish, and specialized tools that he'd accumulated over the decades. The work was methodical and precise, the way he'd been taught long ago. The base personnel had initially tried to stop him, but Samuel had all the proper civilian contractor paperwork. He'd somehow managed to secure a maintenance contract through a maze of bureaucratic channels that nobody at the base fully understood. The documents were legitimate, signed by officials whose names carried weight, though most of those officials had long since retired or been transferred to other positions. As Samuel polished the aircraft's massive propeller blades, memories would flood back to him. He remembered the sound of engines roaring to life, the feeling of being pressed back into his seat during takeoff, and the sight of foreign landscapes passing below through small windows. But these weren't the memories of a simple mechanic or even a regular pilot. Young airmen would sometimes stop to watch the old man work, curious about his dedication to what seemed like a hopeless task. Samuel was always polite, but never talkative. He'd nod respectfully when they approached, answer their basic questions with short responses, and then return to his work. None of them ever stayed long enough to see the careful attention he paid to details that only someone with extensive military training would notice. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thompson had been watching Samuel for months from her office window. As the base's deputy commander, she was responsible for security and had received several reports about the mysterious civilian who spent his days working on the old transport plane. Her initial investigation had confirmed that his paperwork was in order, but something about the whole situation bothered her. The way Samuel moved around the aircraft wasn't random or casual. She'd observed him through binoculars and noticed that he followed specific protocols, checking systems in a particular order that suggested formal training. His posture and bearing, even at 70, showed the kind of discipline that came from years of military service. One morning, Thompson decided to approach Samuel directly. She'd served 22 years in the Air Force and prided herself on her ability to read people. As she walked across the tarmac toward the old plane, she could see Samuel working on the aircraft's landing gear, his movements precise and confident. Samuel noticed her approaching and straightened up, setting down his tools. He stood at attention in a way that seemed automatic, ingrained through years of habit. Thompson introduced herself and asked about his work on the plane. Samuel's responses were respectful, but revealed nothing about his background beyond what was already in his contractor files. During their conversation, Thompson noticed several things that didn't add up. Samuel's knowledge of the aircraft was far too detailed for a simple maintenance worker. When she mentioned specific technical systems, he responded with the kind of expertise that took years to develop. More importantly, when a formation of F-16 fighters flew overhead, Samuel's eyes automatically tracked their flight pattern with the focused attention of someone who understood military aviation at a professional level. After Thompson left, Samuel continued his work, but he knew his quiet routine was about to change. He'd seen the recognition in the lieutenant colonel's eyes, the way her expression had shifted when she realized he was more than he appeared to be. For 3 years, he'd hoped to remain invisible, to simply tend to the old aircraft while processing his grief and guilt in solitude. The plane he cleaned so carefully had special significance that went far beyond nostalgia. Every rivet he polished, every surface he cleaned, was connected to memories he'd tried to bury but couldn't forget. The aircraft represented both his greatest triumph and his deepest regret, a reminder of a mission that had changed the course of history in ways the public would never know. As Samuel packed up his tools that evening, he looked back at the C-130 one more time. Tomorrow would bring new questions, and he suspected his carefully maintained anonymity was about to come to an end. The old plane sat silent in the fading light, holding secrets that only Samuel and a handful of others still living could understand. Samuel had chosen this particular aircraft for his daily ritual because it was identical to the one he'd flown on a classified mission 47 years earlier. A mission that had required him to make split-second decisions that saved thousands of lives, but cost him everything he'd held dear. The guilt and the weight of keeping classified secrets for nearly 5 decades had driven him to seek some form of redemption through this simple act of service. As he walked toward the base gate for what might be the last time as an anonymous contractor, Samuel wondered if it was finally time to tell someone the truth about who he really was and what he'd done in service to his country. The old plane would be waiting for him tomorrow morning, just as it had been for the past 3 years, but everything else was about to change. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel Martinez was hiding something significant. After their brief conversation by the old C-130, she'd spent hours reviewing his contractor files, looking for any detail that might explain her growing suspicions. The paperwork was thorough but somehow too perfect, as if someone had carefully constructed a believable background that would pass casual inspection but might not survive deeper scrutiny. Thompson decided to conduct her own investigation. She started by calling the references listed in Samuel's file, expecting to reach former employers or colleagues who could provide insight into his background. What she discovered was troubling. 2 of the phone numbers were disconnected, and the third led to a small auto repair shop whose owner claimed to have never heard of Samuel Martinez. The addresses listed for Samuel's previous employment led to businesses that had closed years earlier or, in one case, had never existed at all. Thompson realized she was dealing with a carefully constructed false identity, which raised serious questions about who Samuel really was and why he needed to hide his true background. Intrigued and concerned about potential security implications, Thompson reached out to her contacts in military intelligence. She provided Samuel's photograph and the limited information from his contractor files, requesting a discreet background check. What came back 2 days later was even more puzzling than she'd expected. According to the intelligence report, Samuel Martinez didn't exist in any official capacity before 5 years ago, when he'd first applied for a Social Security number using documentation that appeared legitimate but couldn't be verified through normal channels. The person in the photograph, however, bore a striking resemblance to someone in classified military files, but those files were so heavily redacted that Thompson couldn't access the details without higher authorization. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his daily routine, though he'd noticed increased surveillance around the airfield. Security cameras that had been dormant for years were suddenly active, and he'd spotted unmarked vehicles parked in positions that offered clear views of his work area. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone with sufficient authority and curiosity would dig deep enough to uncover his real identity. The breakthrough came when Thompson decided to consult with Brigadier General Marcus Hayes, a decorated veteran who had recently been assigned to oversee special operations at Nellis. Hayes had served in various classified capacities throughout his career and had access to historical records that were beyond Thompson's security clearance. When Thompson showed Hayes the surveillance photos of Samuel, the general's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and he stared at the images for several long minutes before asking Thompson to repeat everything she knew about the mysterious contractor. Hayes had recognized Samuel immediately, though the man in the photos was much older than the person in his memories. 47 years earlier, then Captain Marcus Hayes had been a young intelligence officer assigned to coordinate a highly classified rescue mission in Southeast Asia. The mission had required the skills of the Air Force's most elite pilots, men who could fly dangerous missions in hostile territory with minimal support and maximum secrecy. The pilot chosen for that particular mission had been Major Samuel Eduardo Martinez, one of the most decorated and skilled aviators in the Air Force's Special Operations community. Martinez had volunteered for a mission that everyone knew was essentially a suicide run, an attempt to rescue American prisoners of war from a heavily fortified compound deep in enemy territory. Hayes remembered the briefing room where Martinez had accepted the assignment without hesitation, even though the intelligence estimates gave him less than a 30% chance of survival. The mission required flying an unmarked C-130 transport plane through enemy airspace, landing in a small clearing under cover of darkness, and extracting 12 prisoners who had been held captive for over 2 years. What made the mission even more dangerous was the political climate of the time. The operation was completely unofficial, conducted without congressional oversight or public knowledge. If Martinez was captured or killed, the government would deny any knowledge of the mission. He would be listed as missing in action during a routine training flight, and his family would never know the truth about his sacrifice. Hayes had been the last person to speak with Martinez before takeoff. The pilot had asked only one favor, that if he didn't return, Hayes would ensure that his wife and young daughter would be taken care of financially. Martinez had seemed calm and focused, showing no sign of fear despite the enormous risks he was about to face. The mission had been a success beyond anyone's expectations. Martinez had not only rescued all 12 prisoners, but had also brought back crucial intelligence about enemy operations and the location of other prison camps. His flying skills and quick thinking under pressure had saved lives and potentially shortened the war by providing information that led to other successful rescue operations. But success had come at a terrible personal cost for Martinez. The stress of the mission and the requirement to maintain absolute secrecy about his actions had taken a psychological toll that became apparent only after his return. Martinez began experiencing what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by the fact that he couldn't seek treatment without revealing classified information. Hayes remembered the gradual deterioration of Martinez's mental state in the months following the mission. The pilot became withdrawn and began making mistakes during routine flights. His marriage suffered as he struggled to explain his frequent nightmares and emotional distance without revealing the classified nature of his recent experiences. The situation reached a crisis point when Martinez's wife filed for divorce, citing his erratic behavior and emotional unavailability. She was granted full custody of their daughter, and Martinez was transferred to a desk job while his superiors decided how to handle his declining condition. What happened next was something that Hayes had regretted for decades. Instead of getting Martinez the help he needed, the Air Force had quietly encouraged him to resign his commission and disappear from official records. The classified nature of his most important mission made it impossible to use his heroic actions as justification for medical treatment or disability benefits. Martinez had been given a new identity and a modest pension that would allow him to live quietly somewhere far from his former life. In exchange, He was required to sign agreements that prevented him from ever discussing his military service or the rescue mission that had defined his career. Hayes had lost track of Martinez after 1978, assuming that the former pilot had settled somewhere and built a new life under his assumed identity. The intelligence community had moved on to other crises and forgotten about the hero who had sacrificed everything for his country and received nothing in return except the burden of keeping life-saving secrets. Now, nearly 50 years later, Hayes was looking at photographs of that same man. Aged and weathered, but still maintaining a connection to his past through the daily care of a plane identical to the one he'd flown on his most important mission. Hayes realized that Samuel's daily ritual wasn't just the eccentric behavior of a grief-stricken widower. It was the action of a man trying to find some form of peace with a past that he'd never been allowed to properly honor or discuss. Every day spent cleaning and maintaining the old aircraft was Samuel's way of paying tribute to the mission and the men he'd saved, while processing guilt and trauma that had been buried for decades. General Hayes knew he had a decision to make. He could maintain the official silence that had protected classified operations for nearly half a century, or he could finally acknowledge the sacrifice of a hero who had never received the recognition he deserved. After 47 years of secrecy, it might finally be time for the truth to emerge. General Hayes spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience before making the decision that would change Samuel Martinez's life forever. On Thursday morning, instead of watching from his office window, Hayes walked across the tarmac to meet the man he'd known as one of the Air Force's greatest heroes. Samuel was polishing the aircraft's nose cone when he noticed the general approaching. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the officer's bearing and gait. As Hayes drew closer, Samuel's hands began to shake slightly. The face had aged and carried more weight. But the eyes were unmistakably those of the young captain who had briefed him for the most dangerous mission of his life. Hayes stopped a few feet away and spoke quietly. "Hello, Major Martinez. It's been a long time." The use of his real name and former rank hit Samuel like a physical blow. For 47 years, nobody had called him by his military title or acknowledged his true identity. He set down his polishing cloth and stood slowly, his 70-year-old body straightening into the military posture that had never truly left him. The two men looked at each other in silence for several moments, decades of separation and secrets hanging between them like a weight. Hayes was the first to speak again. "I know what you did in 1978. I know about the mission, the men you saved, and what it cost you afterward. I also know that you never received the recognition you deserved." Samuel's voice was rough with emotion when he finally responded. "That was classified, sir. Still is, as far as I know." Even after all these years, his first instinct was to protect the secrets he'd been trained to keep. Hayes nodded respectfully. "It was classified, but times have changed. Most of the men you rescued have passed away, and those who remain have been asking questions about their rescue for years. The political situation that made secrecy necessary no longer exists. More importantly, I believe you've earned the right to have your story told." Over the next hour, Hayes explained how the world had changed since 1978. The rescued prisoners had eventually been debriefed and released, though they were never told the details of their rescue operation. Several had become advocates for veterans' rights and had spent years trying to identify the pilot who had saved their lives so they could thank him personally. Hayes revealed that the intelligence community had been gradually declassifying operations from the Vietnam era, and Samuel's mission was being considered for recognition as part of a broader effort to honor previously secret heroic actions. The bureaucratic wheels moved slowly, but there was now a path for Samuel to receive official acknowledgement of his service. Samuel listened in amazement as Hayes described developments he'd never imagined possible. For nearly 5 decades, he'd believed that his most important contribution to his country would remain forever hidden. The isolation and secrecy had contributed to the breakdown of his marriage and had forced him to live under an assumed identity, cut off from the military community that had defined his life. The general explained that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's investigation had actually triggered a review of Samuel's case. When intelligence analysts had run his photograph through updated facial recognition systems, they'd identified him immediately and flagged his file for attention. The review had revealed that many of the reasons for maintaining secrecy about his mission no longer applied. Hayes had come prepared with official documentation that would allow Samuel to reclaim his true identity and receive the military benefits he'd been denied for decades. More importantly, the Air Force was prepared to recommend him for the Medal of Honor, recognition that had been impossible to award when the mission itself couldn't be acknowledged. Samuel was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Hayes was telling him. For years, he'd lived with the weight of knowing that 12 men were alive because of his actions, but he'd never been able to share that knowledge with anyone. His wife, Martha, had died without ever knowing why her husband sometimes woke up screaming or why certain sounds would cause him to freeze with terror. The psychological burden of maintaining such significant secrets had shaped every aspect of Samuel's life for nearly 5 decades. He'd chosen to live in isolation, believing that forming close relationships would inevitably lead to questions he couldn't answer. Even his daily ritual with the old aircraft had been a solitary activity, a private way of honoring memories he wasn't allowed to discuss. Hayes revealed that 3 of the rescued prisoners were still alive and had been informed about the investigation into Samuel's identity. They had requested permission to meet their rescuer and thank him personally for giving them the chance to return home to their families. For men who had spent years as prisoners of war, the memory of their dramatic rescue had been one of the most important experiences of their lives. As they spoke beside the old C-130, Hayes also shared news about Samuel's family. His daughter, now in her 50s, had never stopped wondering about her father's abrupt departure from their lives. She had become a military historian, partly motivated by questions about her father's service that she'd never been able to answer. Through careful channels, she had been contacted and informed about the situation. Samuel learned that his daughter had never blamed him for the divorce or his absence from her life. As an adult studying military history, she had come to understand that some veterans carried burdens they couldn't share, and that her father's behavior had likely been the result of traumatic experiences he couldn't discuss. The news that his daughter wanted to rebuild their relationship was perhaps the most emotional revelation of all. Samuel had convinced himself that she was better off without contact with him, believing that his psychological struggles would only bring pain to her life. Learning that she had actually spent years hoping to reconnect with him brought tears to his eyes for the first time in decades. Hayes explained that the process of official recognition would take several months to complete, but Samuel was immediately eligible for veterans' medical benefits and could begin receiving treatment for the post-traumatic stress that had affected him for so long. The Air Force had also arranged for him to receive back pay for the pension benefits he should have been receiving all along. As their conversation drew to a close, Hayes made one final revelation that brought Samuel's long journey full circle. The old C-130 that Samuel had been maintaining so carefully was going to be restored and placed in the Air Force Museum as a memorial to classified rescue operations. Samuel would be invited to participate in the restoration process and to attend the dedication ceremony where his mission would finally be publicly honored. Samuel looked at the aircraft with new eyes, realizing that his instinctive need to care for it had been preparing for this moment. The plane would become a lasting tribute, not just to his actions, but to all the unknown heroes who had risked everything in secret missions that the public would never learn about. That evening, for the first time in 47 years, Samuel Martinez went to sleep, knowing that his real name, his true story, and his heroic actions would finally be acknowledged. The old man who had spent years cleaning a forgotten plane in solitude was about to reclaim his identity as Major Samuel Eduardo Martinez, one of the Air Force's greatest heroes. The next morning, Samuel returned to the aircraft one last time as an anonymous contractor. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of restoration as himself, working alongside engineers and historians who would help preserve the memory of his mission for future generations. The long years of secrets and isolation were finally coming to an end, replaced by the recognition and peace he had never dared to hope for.